Mitchell summed up the issues very well, actually, in a column for The Guardian a couple of weeks back. He said, "A flourishing diverse media is essential to a functioning democracy. We have neither." Our purpose today is to interrogate what's wrong with the media. We are going to be looking at misrepresentation, distortion, and lies. We'll be looking at prejudice and discrimination. Eventually, Hacked Off will turn up with a petition for you to sign against racism in the media. We'll be looking at concentration of ownership, and I've stupidly forgotten to pick up the booklet, but there is a book on the registration desk which has all the latest data on media ownership that's literally just been launched this week. Please take that and read it. There's a session on that later this afternoon. We'll be looking at lack of accountability in the media, and we'll be looking at the BBC that is increasingly positioning itself as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. We'll be concerned to talk about what we do about the digital giants in our world and the increasing impoverishment of local news, but then, crucially, we want to determine what we can do about it. So this is not just a place to interrogate what's wrong, it's also to figure out how we can change the media we have and become the media we want. A fairer, freer, more accurate and more representative media system that's capable of informing and nourishing the kind of inclusive public debate that is the lifeblood of functioning democracies. Some ideas about how to do that you will find in the Media Manifesto that the Media Reform Coalition has put together. Please take this away and debate it in your groups, with your friends, with your colleagues. And if you agree, in the end session, we will be putting forward a model motion that you can take away and vote on in your organisations and present to your members of parliament, to your parties, and to those who have the power to make the changes we need to see. Here we have a space today which is for activists, for academics, for campaigners of all types to come and debate what we think are the most pressing issues of our times. And our first speaker is all three of those things. He is a Guardian commentator, a Labour activist, writer of 2 books and a third just about to come, I think. The 2 books I know of or read, the Chavs, The Demonisation of the Working Class, and The Establishment and How They Get Away with It. I'm sure he'll tell you a bit about the book that's about to be published. He will be very well known to many of you for all the right reasons. So I want you to please put your hands together and give Owen Jones a very warm welcome.
Well, firstly, it's a huge honour to be here, and I know how much effort, how much time's gone in. An amazing team makes this possible. Can we give them another round of applause? So, right, what I'm going to do, I don't normally read, but to be honest, I overdid it last night. My liver has reminded me I'm not actually 80, so that's probably for the best for all involved. But I just want to say this is such an important day. The media reform movement, I think, is coming of age in this country in a way it already has in lots of ways across the Atlantic. And obviously, given the events of the last day, and I'll talk a little bit in terms of the speech itself, the media outlets and mainstream politicians have spent the last day or two talking about the horrendous far-right terrorist atrocity against dozens of Muslims, even though they themselves are complicit in whipping up systematically racism, bigotry in many forms, years after years. They are complicit in what has happened, and we need to call that out. And that's why one of the many reasons today is so important. The fact that racism and bigotry has been systematically whipped up and peddled by the mainstream media in this country and across the world. One of the last, I looked at the Twitter feed of the terrorist who murdered those dozens of people. One of the last articles he shared was an anti-Muslim article from the Daily Express. That's what we're dealing with. And I interviewed just over a week ago a survivor of Anders Breivik's atrocity in Atoya just 8 years ago now, which was when dozens of young socialists were murdered by a far-right terrorist, mainly on the basis, as he put it, that they were complicit in the Islamisation of Norway and Europe. That should have been enough of a wake-up call, but as the survivor put it to me, that atrocity ended up being treated like an act of God, like bad weather, like a hurricane, rather than what it was, which was a far-right terrorist attack, which the mainstream media and mainstream politicians are complicit in. They are legitimising and fueling the far right, and we will take a stand. And today, I hope that's what this is partly about, as well as the other issues I'm going to talk about. Now, what I'm going to do, so I'm going to read basically some stuff from my book, which is 16 months overdue, so not going well. So I'm going to read it out, I'm going to talk for a while, fingers crossed this goes well. And then, there's a lot going on today. I'm off to Stretton to campaign for a by-election. There's also the anti-racism protest today, which is obviously very important. So there's a lot going on today, but it's a big honour and pleasure to be here again. Right, let's kick off. Our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, declared Thomas Jefferson, and that cannot be limited without being lost. The American founding father had a point. A free press should be a pillar of a properly functioning democracy. It should inform and educate the public about their own society and the world around them, hold the powerful to account, expose uncomfortable truths, shed light on political debate, challenge myths, highlight injustice, and create an active and informed citizenry. But that is what we lack. Much of the media in the West and beyond are the playthings of a tiny elite of wealthy oligarchs, the Rupert Murdochs, the Michael Bloombergs, the Silvio Berlusconis, the Barclay brothers. In the US alone, just 8 media corporations own 788 television stations. Owning a newspaper has always been a means of wielding political influence. As the British media mogul Lord Beaverbrook put it, in 1948 to the Royal Commission on the Press, and he ran the Daily Express, as he put it, the newspaper, purely for the purpose of making propaganda, these are his own words, good to have some honesty, and with no other object. I look at it as a purely propagandist project. Owning a newspaper gives direct access to politicians. Between 1988 and 2012, Murdoch met with senior politicians at least 113 times. Even after the Murdoch empire was embroiled in a phone hacking scandal, such direct access did not stop. Between April 2015 and September 2016 alone, Murdoch executives met ministers or their advisors at least 22 times. Under the Trump administration, Murdoch calls the president at least once a week. As the profitability of the media collapses, owning a media outlet becomes ever less a means of making money and even more about political power, influence, and patronage. When Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, now the world's wealthiest man, bought the Washington Post for $250 million in 2013, it was for a fraction of what it was worth just a decade earlier. But for Bezos and his multi-billionaire fortune, this was fair change. And now he had bought huge influence with a prestigious newspaper in the nation's capital. Or take Murdoch, who's maintained his ownership of Britain's loss-making Times newspaper because it buys influence in elite circles. Indeed, as the Russian media mogul Yevgeny Lebedev, whose family owned the Independent and London's near-monopoly newspaper, the Evening Standard, candidly put it, it's unreasonable to expect individuals to spend millions on newspapers and not have access to politicians. While some moguls are more conservative or liberal than others, all are leading members of a status quo, which is in their interest to defend, have an adversarial relationship with organised labour, and have every incentive to oppose policies which redistribute wealth and income, which, after all, will target their own fortunes. And they have a vested interest in opposing policies and movements which would, even timidly, challenge a status quo from which they benefit and on which they thrive. Unsurprisingly, their media outlets ignore, ridicule, or demonise any challenge to the existing order. Ideas and beliefs which are widespread, even dominant among public opinion, have fringe status amongst the media. For example, whilst overwhelming majorities of Britain support public ownership of utilities, almost no national press outlet is supportive, and a large majority are outright hostile. In the US, whilst 57% of self-declared Democrats, representing tens of millions of Americans, have a positive view of socialism, virtually no pundits supportive of socialism appear on the nation's TV screens or have newspaper columns. Minorities lacking an organised, powerful collective voice, like migrants, refugees, and Muslims are routinely scapegoated for injustices caused by the self-interest or neglect of the powerful, whether it be the lack of secure jobs and homes, stagnating living standards, or strained and decaying public services. Social problems such as poverty and unemployment are frequently portrayed not as defects of the prevailing economic system, but as the results of individual failings, such as laziness and a lack of personal effort. Myths, dishonesty, half-truths, distortions, and outright lies are propagated, with little effective means of redress, providing no meaningful incentive for such outlets to avoid endlessly engaging in such behaviour. Political coverage is frequently trivialised, treated almost as a crude soap opera, reduced to personalities and tittle-tattle, rather than explained as competing ideas and worldviews, or placed in a broader social or economic context. Because the mainstream media, with exceptions, is dependent on revenue for admittedly steeply declining advertising revenue, it is by definition tied to a corporate agenda. This can even lead to censorship. In 2015, British Conservative commentator Peter Owen dramatically resigned from the Daily Telegraph newspaper after it failed to cover a scandal involving the HSBC Bank because it feared losing advertising revenue. Becoming a journalist on a national media outlet is financially prohibitive in many countries, disproportionately restricting entrance to the media profession to those from privileged backgrounds, skewing news coverage according to the experiences, prejudices, and priorities of those who have benefited from the existing system. In Britain, for example, one government study suggested that only doctors hailed from more privileged backgrounds than national journalists. Another 2014 report suggested that 43% of newspaper columnists hailed from private schools compared to just 7% of the wider population. Whilst in 2016, the educational charity the Sutton Trust found that over half of the country's top journalists were privately educated, while just 19% attended a comprehensive school compared to nearly 90% of the population. In the US, leading media organisations failed to represent the diversity of the American Republic, while the evidence shows that journalists are disproportionately drawn from affluent, privileged backgrounds. In both countries, ethnic minorities are grossly underrepresented in the media, while women are sorely lacking in key journalistic and editorial roles. According to one study by Women in Journalism, just a quarter of British front pages in one randomly selected time frame in 2017 were written by women. Prominent journalists extol a sense of individualistic scepticism, of defiant independence. If questioned, and I know this, they will angrily decry, "Nobody tells me what to write." But nobody has to. All too often, they would not have their positions if they deviated substantially from the editorial line, and they could expect to fear for their jobs if they did. Suffocating groupthink afflicts the media in all too many nations. It is not just a domestic sphere. Much of the media echoes the priorities and strategic interests of current Western foreign policy, often demonstrating a combination of credulity, jingoism, and a hounding of critics in the build-up to any given war or military intervention. For example, it's estimated that all 175 of Rupert Murdoch's newspaper outlets backed the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Much of the media has played a critical role too in promoting the dogma of "there is no alternative," which fosters a sense of resignation to injustice. Passivity on the one hand, and anger at the wrong targets on the other, are deliberate consequences. It is striking that in Britain, particularly dominated by aggressively partisan right-wing media outlets, a 2017 study found that trust in the written press is the lowest in Europe, lower than Serbia or Hungary, which is effectively dictatorship, with a dire net level of minus 51%. The rise of the internet and the collapse of newspaper advertising revenue, in the US alone it fell from $65 billion in 2000 to less than $19 billion in 2016, have thrown traditional media outlets into crisis. Their underlying failings have only worsened as a consequence. The growing precariousness of work in the media and the weakening of trade unions, which gave media workers at least some ability to defend themselves, means that journalists are increasingly more subordinate to their editors, themselves generally appointed by rich moguls. Being made to feel perpetually in fear of losing your income makes you less likely to step over the lines drawn, explicitly or otherwise, explicitly or otherwise by your employers. That investigative journalism, with its focus on holding the wealthy and the powerful to account, often had an innately more progressive bias, already hardly enamoured itself to media moguls. For example, after Rupert Murdoch took over Britain's Sunday Times newspaper, he gutted its flagship award-winning investigative insight team. But the collapse in funding means an even further curtailing of investigative journalism, which is expensive, time-consuming, and has no guarantee of success, but which has a critical role in holding powerful interests to account. Who will benefit more than the corrupt? As journalist and the creator of The Wire, David Simon, put it in 2009, the collapsing media model has got to be one of the greatest dreams in the history of American corruption. Another victim of the great media collapse is foreign reporting, an expensive endeavour that struggles to attract advertising revenue. A 2010 study found that there were nearly 40% fewer international reporters in 4 British newspapers compared to 30 years earlier. The situation has surely only deteriorated in the decade since. We are left unable to understand our true place in the world or the impact of what Western governments do in our name in the international arena. We inevitably become more insular. The great media implosion means that the news agenda is set even more on the terms of the corporate and the wealthy interests than before. The number of the journalists in the US is in freefall. Newsroom employment fell by 23% between 2008 and 2017, an overall loss of 27,000 jobs. In newspapers specifically, employment is in a state of utter collapse. Their newsroom employees fell by an astonishing, that was overall in broadcasters, but in the news, by an astonishing 45% over the same time period. In Britain, 228 local newspapers closed between 2005 and 2018, whilst the number of regional journalists is estimated to have halved to 6,500. And yet the output of leading newspapers has only grown. After all, they are now expected to provide 24-hour news on the often sizable online news portals. That means fewer but more hard-pressed journalists reporting on everything from local government to court trials to the provision of public services, but it also makes them more dependent on press releases and public relations. PR, an industry which manipulates public perceptions and attitudes on behalf of its wealthy clients, has exploded in size. In Britain, for example, the financial worth of PR jumped from 9.62 billion in 2013 to 14 billion 3 years later. Its workforce jumped from 62,000 to 86,000 in just those 3 years. The parallel decline in journalists and media resources and rise in the PR industry, itself partly staffed by well-connected former journalists, has a depressing consequence. It means that all too many of the remaining journalists are essentially rewriting corporate propaganda, or what the investigative journalist Nick Davies calls journalism. None of this is to say that there are not good journalists in prominent positions, that injustices aren't ever exposed, or that the powerful aren't ever held to account. The objection to the media, in its current form, is how it operates as a system. A democracy which lacks a thriving, genuinely free and independent, rigorous media is not a properly functioning democracy at all. Someone who knows about the failures of the current media system all too well is Robert McChesney, an Illinois-based academic and media activist in his mid-60s. In the early 1980s, he was a journalist and magazine publisher in Seattle and went on to study media at graduate school. At the turn of the century, he began writing pamphlets about the state of media activism in the US and around the world with John Nichols, a progressive journalist and author. Our argument back then was that the rest of the world was hipper to media activism than the US, that we were well behind, he explains to me. We said that the US had to get its act together. An associate of his named Josh Silver, an activist who focuses on taking money out of politics, suggested putting their work to practical use, and so together they launched Free Press in 2003. Its whole basis was to build an army of people so we could build a movement and build pressure on media reform, he says, and to expand the debate beyond what money interests wanted. Now that turned out 2003 to be a particularly fortuitous year for a new media reform movement. At its birth of the movement, the Federal Communications Commission, then under the chairmanship of Michael Powell, an appointee of President George W. Bush, announced plans to relax limits on media ownership, allowing media corporations to buy more radio, TV, and cable systems. The media conglomerates, including the likes of the Murdoch Empire, were naturally delighted that they would be able to increase their media holdings. Their cheerleading for Bush in the 2000 presidential election had apparently paid off. 2003, of course, was notable for another reason. The Iraq War provoked a surge of activism. Hundreds of thousands took to the streets of New York City alone. All the activists were incensed, McChesney recalls. There was this war with the media extolling how great it was, mission accomplished and all the rest. Then they found out that these corporations were going to buy up the remaining media. It was like lighting a keg of gasoline. Free press found itself in a leadership position. Suddenly people wanted to talk about media issues. FCC decisions normally attracted very little public attention, but this time hundreds of thousands signed petitions and sent emails to the Commission, near unanimously opposing the proposals. Chicago's council passed a resolution opposing the FCC, and polling showed that 5 months after the plan was announced, half thought it would have a negative impact on the country, with just 10% believing it would be positive. Amongst those who've heard most about the proposals, 70% were opposed and just 6% supported. Under pressure from public opinion, US senators moved to act. We are moving to roll back one of the most complete cave-ins for corporate interests I've ever seen by what is supposed to be a federal regulatory agency, declared Democratic Senator Byron Duggan. Even Republican senators felt compelled to announce the FCC plans. Sensing the FCC was on the defensive, a vast lobbying effort ranging from free press to the trade union movement targeted national politicians. The movement won. Courts damned the proposals, and they eventually died in Congress. But McChesney is rather sanguine about the win. It was no great victory, the media still sucked. We didn't get better journalism, it showed we could organise, it gave us tremendous practical experience, but it showed the limits of what we could do. It stopped us from going terrible to even more terrible. But turning it around from terrible to adequate or decent, let alone good, is a whole different issue. Here is the critical issue. How can a truly free media be built? It is the crisis of this model of funding that opens up a fork in the road. Either there is a continued degeneration of the media in ways that only benefit vested interests at the top of society, or bold reforms are offered which promote a newly diverse, independent, rigorous media ecosystem. Have no doubt, though, the direction we may decide whether even the limited democracy we have today survives or perishes. One possible counterweight to a declining mogul-dominated press are, of course, I will be discussing this, I know a lot today, public broadcasters. The planet's most prestigious such broadcaster is undoubtedly the BBC, an organisation which is not dependent wholly on commercial advertising. Undoubtedly, its defenders have much to be proud of in its output, which spans drama, entertainment, sports, comedy, science, nature, and much else. But its much vaunted claims to news impartiality are derisory. A 2013 study by Cardiff University found its coverage provides more space for conservative voices in the Labour opposition, I suspect that's the worst, then that on 6 o'clock news, business representatives outnumber trade union representatives by 19 to 1, and that during the financial crash, the interviewees selected by the flagship Today programme were dominated by voices from the City of London, interrogated as though they were experts and witnesses, rather than putting them in the dock as figures involved in a disaster with serious questions to answer. There was another systemic flaw too. The BBC's daily news coverage is shaped by the main stories in the British press. Yet the British press is, editorially speaking, dominated by the right. Inevitably then, the BBC's daily news priorities are dictated by predominantly right-wing media. The BBC's defenders point out that both left and right attack it for bias against their respective causes, and that this is evidence of its neutrality. But this is a logical fallacy. Both left and right attack the criminal justice system, the former for being racist and with insufficient emphasis on rehabilitation, the latter for being insufficiently punitive. But that isn't evidence that the criminal justice system has the balance just right. As one senior BBC presenter put it to me, the centre of gravity within the BBC can be described as Blairite, that is, both socially liberal, for example, supportive of LGBT rights and immigration, and wedded to market economics. Both contemporary left and right, therefore, object to it in different ways. That ideology is not neutral. Indeed, its flagship political interviewer, till recently, Andrew Neil, is a hardened Thatcherite who has publicly backed a radical reduction in tax, these are his words, and public spending of the share of the economy, and uses his Twitter feed to promote rightist causes such as climate change scepticism. His former boss at the BBC, Robbie Gibbs, was a former Tory researcher who left in 2017 to become the Conservative Prime Minister's Chief of Communications. That someone with equally leftist politics would ever fill such a position is for the birds. The former BBC political editor Nick Robinson is a former chairman of the Young Conservatives, while the Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May, the former Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer George Osborne, and the former Conservative Mayor of London Boris Johnson all hired their chief spin doctors from the BBC. Could the BBC become a genuinely independent political broadcaster which could serve as a model for other countries? Tom Mills, who's probably in the audience, is a British researcher who dedicates much of his life to the puzzle of how the BBC can be reformed. Since the beginning of the BBC, it's been very close to the state establishment it explains. Until the 1990s, the MI5 security services subjected job applications to political vetting. The government of the day is in charge of the BBC's funding taps, setting the level of the public licence fee used to fund it, and is responsible for renewing its annual royal charter, allowing it to exert political pressure. Under Tory governments, the constant threat of privatisation serves as a disciplining measure too. Ministers routinely part pressure on it. For example, the Thatcher government appointed Marmaduke Hussey, a union-busting media executive who was closely linked to the Conservatives, as a means to curtail corporations and greater independence, which the government claimed was actually evidence of left-wing sympathies. To the delight of Thatcher, Hussey forced out the then Director General, Alistair Milne. His son is called Seamus. Under a later Tory-led government in 2010, the BBC came under fire when it was revealed that the then Director General, Mark Thompson, attended Downing Street to discuss upcoming programmes on the government's austerity measures. Its governing bodies are stuffed full of establishment appointees. For example, members of the BBC Trust, in place until 2017, included the likes of the chairman of arms company BAE Systems and the CEO of a merchant bank. Its chairman was Chris Patten, a former Conservative politician and the last governor of Hong Kong. Prior to him, the chairman of the BBC until 2004 was Gavin Davies, who was close to then governing New Labour. Indeed, his wife was a private secretary to Prime Minister Gordon Brown. The Director General of the BBC, Greg Dyke, was also close to the New Labour clique. The current chairman of the BBC is Sir David Cecil Clementi, a business executive and the former chairman of insurance giant Prudential. From political appointees to business executives, the BBC is not independent of the British establishment, but at its very epicentre. When the BBC was at its most free and independent, it was a period of rapid growth in the 1960s onwards, argues Mills. It had a lot of income from the expansion of colour television. It didn't have to go back to the government to ask for more money, and it expanded very quickly. So management weren't able to efficiently exert control over small parts of the BBC. But since then, the trends have been towards growing commercialisation as well as managerialism. How can its direction be challenged? For Mills and other media reformers, a sound place to start is democratisation. Although the BBC predates Britain's post-war programme of top-down nationalisation, it was based on the same model, a centralised public corporation. Instead, members of the public, as well as staff, could democratically elect members of the BBC board to champion their interests. Decision-making bodies will be basically representative of social stakeholders, Mills suggests. That is, representative of people who make programmes and representative of the people who consume them. All government appointees would end. Commercialisation will be reversed. Instead, the BBC would be placed on an entirely public interest basis. The centralisation of news editorial control would be reversed. Power to set the licence fee would be devolved to an independent regulator, removing political interference. As things stand, the licence fee is regressive, with richer and poorer required to contribute the same amount. Instead, Mills proposes at least some of the funds could be raised through a tax on new digital companies. The BBC today would argue that it is decentralising its news production through so-called local news partnerships. That is offering £8 million a year to local newspapers to work together. In practice, that is merely subsidising private newspaper publishers, instituting slash and burn cuts to their own enterprises. Instead, portions of the BBC budget could be devolved to local areas and not-for-profit platforms to make programmes which discuss local problems, needs and aspirations. That too would break centralised editorial control. A democratised, local, accountable, diverse public broadcaster could offer a template for others to follow. But while an independent, democratically accountable public broadcaster is important, it alone is no solution to a decaying media model, nor in isolation does it build a thriving, pluralistic media which should be the linchpin of a democracy. There are certain reforms which could help. Stronger trade unions would give journalists more power over overbearing management. A so-called conscience clause, as recommended by Britain's National Union of Journalists, written into journalists' contracts, could protect their jobs if they refuse to take part in unethical assignments. Unpaid internships, which by compelling aspiring journalists to work for free, discriminate against those without the financial means to do so, would be abolished. Scholarships to support journalists from underrepresented backgrounds would be introduced. Basic democracy could be brought to media outlets as well. And The Guardian holds ballots of staff on who its editor should be when there's a vacancy. This is only consultative, although the 2 times it's been used, the candidate who topped the ballot became editor. What about compulsory staff ballots for editors in all media outlets of a certain size every, say, 4 or 5 years, for example? Wealthy individuals would be restricted in how much of the media they could buy up, only 1 media outlet per person, reducing the influence over democracy that money can buy. These would be important reforms, but in the grand scheme of it all, relatively modest tweaks. How can an independent, diverse press be constructed when in the current social order, you need big capital to support you if you wish to build a media outlet with any reach? Leo Watkins, who I'm sure is also here again, started his career working for a commercial research service focusing on media and technology. He had a broad set of responsibilities, everything from Apple and Google to asking why news publishers had ceased to make money. His work brought him to analyse the ins and outs of the Murdoch empire, including covering investigations into phone hacking by Murdoch news outlets and campaigning alongside Ed Miliband to oppose the Murdoch takeover of Sky News. I came to realise that there was a very deep-seated crisis in the news, he tells me, or a better way to describe it is there's almost a limit on the ability of capitalism to sustain the level of news production to sustain viable democracies. He leaves no illusion about just how profound he believes the situation to be. This is an existential crisis. Here is capitalism swallowing itself as advertising migrates from subsidising news to subsidising the infrastructure of the internet. As he elegantly puts it, the profitability of the media collapses and the industry shrivels. Here is an opportunity, he posits, for those who believe that the media for so long has been of the rich, for the rich, and by the rich to build something new. We can have a media that's publicly funded, but democratically controlled by the people, he says, rather than directly by the state. On the face of it, this seems like an impossible dream. Surely public subsidies mean a state infringing on the independence of the press. It is striking then that the 2 countries with public subsidies for the press, Norway and Sweden, top the Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index. Such is the protection of an independent press in Norway that even under right-wing rule, the radical leftist newspaper Klassekampen receives extensive public subsidies, which has allowed it to dramatically increase its circulation. But it is surely possible to be more ambitious than that. What if, Robert McChesney proposes, this public subsidy was democratised? Every citizen could be given an allowance of $200 a year, which they could use as they saw fit to support not-for-profit media outlets. It would be a huge public subsidy, but the government would have no say over how it was used. It would be up to the individual, who could donate all of it to one outlet or spread it across multiple publications. Independent journalism could be supported. A quid pro quo would be that all such outlets had to distribute all their output for free on the internet. This would be a fair use policy. Others could freely use that output, but only by crediting it. The cheerleaders of capitalism claim that the system nurtures choice, but the for-profit model has led to a dramatic curtailment of such choice in the media. The ability of capitalism to sustain the vibrant media ecosystem on which a healthy democracy depends is over, if it ever existed, which it didn't. The proposal would offer genuine choice and a sustainable diversity of opinion. But how would it be funded? McChesney is eminently relaxed about this. They always find money for war and bank bailouts, don't they? But Leo Watkins developed his idea. Over £20 billion a year is spent on advertising in Britain. If a tax was imposed on the advertising industry, that would provide substantial revenues. It could be described as a democracy levy, for example. As Watkins designs it, to be eligible for funding, an outlet would have to be a not-for-profit cooperative, ensuring that for-profit businesses aren't subsidised by the public purse, and they would be barred from accepting money from any other source, including advertising, safeguarding their genuine editorial independence. Each individual's allowance could be divided into 2 components, funding for local and regional outlets and separately for national outlets as well. As well as supporting media outlets across the political spectrum, you can see how, for example, health workers could set up an outlet on the health service. Otherwise, marginalised minority groups too could create sustainable outlets to give them a larger, a louder megaphone in society. From sports and leisure pursuits to one-issue campaigns, any outlet which could win sufficient public support could become viable. Each outlet could campaign for members of the public to donate part or all of their allowance, from stalls and town centres to online digital campaigns. Of course, there would have to be an independent regulator to enforce accuracy, not least by ensuring that outlets publish prominent corrections if they disseminate false information. Because the outlets would be democratic cooperatives, the mistreatment and exploitation of journalists would end. They would freely decide their own terms and conditions. Decent wages and the abolition of unpaid internships will mean that the profession is accessible to all. A genuine democracy should not make a citizen's influence and power proportionate to their bank balance, as ours currently does. By opening the media up to all, the proposal will weaken the power of wealthy moguls. Journalists would become accountable to the public alone, not to wealthy individuals and big businesses. It would end media paywalls, which close off the information that citizens need to make informed decisions in a democracy, with the better off more likely to shell out the money needed to access it. Participation might be low to begin with, but would gradually build, and even a relatively small proportion of citizens using their allowances would start to build up an independent media ecosystem. Incentives will be created to engage with some of the most disengaged people in society. Outlets wishing to thrive will have to compete to chase those citizens, not using their allowances, find out why, and try to cater for their interests. In time, of course, there may be mergers or consolidations of bigger outlets, but that will be done in a healthy, democratic way, rather than wealthy individuals purchasing huge swathes of the media. There's another tweet too, put to me by Irina Bolichevsky, a British digital strategist and data consultant. A free internet browser extension could track how much each user spends on each media outlet website and proportionally allocates their allowance automatically. A truly diverse, pluralistic, independent media should be the backbone of a genuine functioning democracy. We have neither. That a moment of crisis for the old media model and a time of mass disillusionment offers an opportunity that must be seized. The old model is not simply broken, it's unsustainable. We deserve so much better. Yesterday, as I started, we woke to the horror of the massacre of dozens of Muslims murdered by a white supremacist fascist terrorist. The atrocity was condemned by media outlets as well as mainstream politicians who have systematically whipped up hatred against Muslims and migrants for years. One of the last articles, as I said, the terrorist shared was from the Daily Express. It's not just the tabloids. The likes of the Times sells itself as a respectable paper of record, and publishes an article by Melanie Phillips headlined with "Islamophobia is a fiction to shut down a debate," and was forced to issue a correction to an entirely distorted front page story, "Christian child forced into Muslim foster care," but of course the damage was already done. We do deserve so much better, and we must fight for it. Let today, this conference, be a rallying cry for a mass media reform movement that will transform not just our broken media, but our broken democracy as well. Thank you.